My name is Małgorzata Pakier, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity at the 14th edition of the Genealogies of Memory. The European Network Remembrance and Solidarity is an international institution devoted to education, research, and commemorative activities related to totalitarianisms and wars in Europe in the 20th century. Since 2011, together with academic partners, we have been organizing annual conferences within the program Genealogies of Memory, whose purpose is to discuss social and cultural memories and memory politics with special focus on Central and Eastern Europe. The conferences have led to publications as well within our series European Remembrance and Solidarity with Routledge, and some of the books are presented here in front of the conference room, and I invite you to have a look at them. Before I pass the floor to my colleagues, I would like to thank the conference esteemed partner institutions for their support and engagement. And these are the University of Warsaw Faculty of Sociology, the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences, Palacki University Olomouc, Polish Oral History Association, Herder Institute, University of Vienna, Memory Studies Association, and the Polish Landed Gentry Society. And now let me introduce to you the conference convener, Anna Wylegała, who will say a few words about the conference.
Good morning. I'm an oral historian, and oral historians tend to tell a lot of stories instead of bringing theories and large introductions. So I would like to start with two stories, but they are very much about the idea of the conference. So the first one comes from the time when I was preparing my book about the agricultural reform in post-war Poland for publication. And I was just to submit the manuscript, and I received quite a few suggestions that I should leave out the chapter about how the gentry in the post-war Poland managed to survive and what was their fate. This was supposed to help the book fit better the current vernacular trend in Polish humanities and especially in the historiography. And I refused because although I did agree that it was the peasants' experience which was largely unspoken about the agricultural reform, I also believe that we cannot research the experience, the memory, and the heritage of the vernacular class, underprivileged class, without researching the elites. I also believe that as social historians, as memory scholars, as scholars in the field of humanities, we should also always listen to the second part of the story, because if not, we cannot get the full picture. So the chapter about the gentry remained in my book, and I never regretted this decision. The second story comes from my fieldwork. So one of my case studies for this book was a small estate of Konary in central Poland that before the war used to belong to the family of Józef Helbich. And many of the interviews I was conducting more than 70 years after the family was expropriated were about the fact that when the Soviets entered in 1945, they tried Helbich. They placed him under the wall. They gathered his workers, and the workers were to decide whether the dziedzic, the already former landowner, was good or bad. So he was not shot because they claimed him good. And one of the most vivid versions of this story was told to me by a couple in their early 80s, which meant that they were small kids during the war. They couldn't have their own biographical memories. So I asked them whether they saw it with their own eyes, and they told, no, of course we didn't. And then I asked whether their parents saw it with their own eyes, and they answered that, of course, they didn't because they had other things to do. So I asked, how would you remember then? And they answered with kind of surprise, how wouldn't we remember? The entire village was talking about it for years. We were talking about it. People were talking about it. So these two stories are very much about the idea of the conference because, at least in Poland, but I also believe that in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Lithuania, and also probably in some other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, we still have a very vivid vernacular memory of the gentry, about their heritage, and about their role in the local communities from which the gentry vanished more than 70 years ago, sometimes more than 8 years ago, like in case of the Eastern Belarus or Eastern Ukraine. Also, the gentry remembers, the former landowning elites remember. And at least in some countries, they maintain their distinct collective identity based on the class distinction. And yet, at the same time, whenever the topic of the gentry memory, heritage, influences enters the public sphere, at least in Poland, it causes a lot of troubles, discomfort, heated debates, showing that it is, I would say, a sociologist, still unfinished social transformation, a very meaningful transformation that is still to be discussed and that can still be a fascinating field of research. And here I'd like to simply quote one sentence from our call for papers. The vital and complex role of the landowning elites in the political, economical, and cultural history of Europe has been extensively researched, resulting in a wealth of literature. However, the question of how this role has been remembered since the dissolution of these elites as social class and what the implications of this memory and legacy are for contemporary European societies has only recently been addressed by sociologists, historians, and anthropologists. I very much hope that it will be addressed in depth during these 3 days of our conference. And to my great satisfaction, it will be addressed comparatively, because I did my research on the agricultural reform and gentry post-war identity in Poland, but I was always very much interested what are the links, what are the connections and disconnections. And that was also one of the ideas of this conference, to make us think about this connections and disconnections. So it will be addressed comparatively. In the context going far beyond Poland, also quite often beyond Central and Eastern Europe, and at least in one case also going beyond Europe as such. And I look forward to hearing colleagues discussing the issue of the former landowning elites, however we call them, nobles, nobility, gentry, aristocracy. So I'm looking forward to hear these papers discussing the memory and the heritage of these elites in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Germany, Belarus, Lithuania, Great Britain, Hungary, and more. And I wish all of you fruitful discussions, and I'm sure we will discover some connections and many disconnections, which will be also very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I will introduce Jan Rydel, Chair of the Conference Academic Committee. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear panelists and participants, ladies and gentlemen, I also want to join the warm welcome to those who participate in this year's edition of the Genealogies of Memory conference, which is dedicated to the remembrance of the nobility, gentry, and aristocracy. I welcome you as a representative of the steering committee of the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, as well as the chair of the Academic Council of this edition of Genealogies. I greet you with immense joy, but also with some sort of anxiety, since, if I'm not mistaken, I was the one who came up with the idea for the topic of the 14th editions of the Genealogies of Memory. Soon after that, I was made aware that researching these social groups is not en vogue these days. I think, however, trends, fashions, and ever-changing correctnesses pass by faster than we think. Only despots attempt to limit our sweet freedom of research. Reassuring myself, or maybe also one of you, with my aspiration for freedom of research, I want to bring your attention to the real challenges that we, that is the Polish initiators of this conference, encountered during the preparation of concept. Firstly, we discussed whether the terms szlachta, arystokracja, ziemiaństwo, nobility, aristocracy, and landed gentry are understood in other countries in the same way as in Poland. Naturally, the answer was no. The term ziemiaństwo, crucial in Poland in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, caused some difficulties and turned out to be basically untranslatable. Ziemiaństwo depicts people who are owners of medium and large lands, who gathered various amounts of wealth. A significant part of the landowners was the Polish nobility, but not all landed gentry were nobility, and not every member of nobility was a landowner. In the 19th century, as a result of structural changes in agriculture and some political changes, a significant part of the members of the nobility, mostly children of noblemen, left their properties, gained education, and contributed to the formation of intelligentsia. That is why Polish intelligentsia, in the significant part, consisted of people with noble roots. They transposed values and patterns of behavior characteristic to the Polish nobility onto this newly created social group. Of course, I know the issue of the social origins of the Polish intelligentsia and the influence of noble or post-noble identity on this social group has been a subject of dispute or controversy in Polish social sciences for decades. Simultaneously, contrary to the mythologized tradition of egalitarianism within the nobility that emerged from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Polish aristocracy represented an elitist and relatively closed social group, which should not be confused with landed gentry, even though it nominally belonged to it. It is difficult to imagine that history of Poland, at least till the Second World War, without the landed gentry and their intelligentsia descendants, who have always been involved in politics, cultural and scientific life and modernization processes as a part of the nation's leadership. Therefore, if we accept the Polish reality of the 19th and 20th century as it was, we must, I think, remember this social group affirmatively. An easy, noticeable, yet very superficial evidence of this is the continuing popularity of architecture imitating noble manners in contemporary Poland. Is the nobility or landed gentry remembered in a similar way and with similar intensity outside Poland? This was another question that troubled us when we initiated the conference. The last challenge that must be addressed is that Polish nobility and landed gentry were also present on predominantly Ukrainian, Belarusian, Lithuanian, and to some extent Latvian lands. I doubt that the Polish landed gentry is positively remembered in the regions where the social structures, ethnicity, and religion are so different. I do wish to expand my knowledge of that aspects thanks to this conference. I also hope that during our conference we will find out whether there is a memory of nobility, gentry, and aristocracy in these countries and what this memory is like, if it is actually present in the consciousness of the societies you are researching. Closing this speech in the name of the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, I want to thank Professor Anna Wilegała, who was convener of this conference, turned our ideas and intuitions into the language of modern science. I sincerely acknowledge all the members of the Academic Council, Dr. Simon Doing, Professor Konstantin Jordasi, Dr. Marcin Schirmer, Professor Radmila Szwarzyczkowa-Slabakowa, Professor Ewa Staroj-Kesdi, Professor Maria Wakunik, Professor Joanna Wawrzyniak, and Professor Tomasz Zarycki. I would like to thank Professor Joanna Wawrzyniak and Dr. Małgorzata Pakier, who are initiators of the whole Genealogies of Memory project. Last but not least, I want to thank Dr. Konrad Bielecki and his team, who brilliantly organized the edition of the Genealogies of Memory conference. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish us all a successful and fruitful conference. Thank you very much.
So we can move now to the first point in the program, which is the keynote by Professor Longina Jakubowska, and the session will be chaired by Jan Rydel.
Let me introduce our honorable lecturer. Longina Jakubowska was born in Warsaw. She received her Magister in Ethnography at Warsaw University and followed her education at the State University of New York. There, in 1985, she obtained her PhD in anthropology. She worked at various American universities until she left for Netherlands in 1904 to join at first University of Amsterdam and Radboud University in Nijmegen, finally to work at Utrecht University until her retirement in 2018. The range of her academic interests spans the globe from Armenia to the Middle East to Central Europe. Her main area of expertise in the Middle East were the anthropology of Bedouin communities in the Sinai Desert. The articles she subsequently published concerned social changes, colonization, identity politics, gender relations, and spiritual beliefs of this group. The main book of our guest, under the title Patrons of History, Nobility, Capital, and Political Transitions in Poland, marked a shift in her interest toward her home country. The research was sponsored by Fulbright Research Scholarship and received Best Book 2012 award from Eastern European Association. American anthropologist Donna Goldstein wrote about this book. Over centuries, the Polish Szlachta was skillfully fused familial identities with those of the Polish nation and Western civilization. But Jakubowska illuminates the class of and even racial dimensions of noble myth-making. The continuing magic of the old surnames suggests that Polish social structure has more in common with other old countries in Western Europe than with post-socialist neighbors in the East. Jakubowska's sensitive analysis of these careers of the national memory is a fine study in historical anthropology, rich in implications for both theory and method. Chris Hahn from the German Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology wrote about our guest's book in a shorter way. I quote, "This is an extraordinary book, undoubtedly one of the most important works on Poland to be written in recent years. Although the author is an anthropologist, this should be essential reading for historians as well, because of both the subject matter and the methodological approach. Dear Professor Jakubowska, we are waiting for your lecture with great joy and excitement."
I hope I will not disappoint. This is funny. Good morning, everyone. It is indeed a great honor to be invited as a keynote speaker at the conference, and indeed the honor granted to me solely because I once wrote a book on the subject of the Gentry. The book was published in 2012, so it's a while ago, and it's great to see new research and a new generation of scholars who undertook the subject. Also, it is wonderful to see that the other side of the coin is being addressed, as a number of books has appeared on the subject of the experience of the peasantry, with Anna Wylęgała, one of the authors. Today, I would like to share with you some remarks on the nature of memory and the challenges it presents in research, especially if that research pertains to elites in general and to Gentry in particular. These remarks are based on my experience of conducting an exploration of the strategies of the Polish Gentry, conscious or unconscious, of endurance in the hostile political climate that marked post-Second World War, the study to which I will be referring today. In order to create this collective biography, I collected life stories corroborated by life histories. So usually, although at the conference we present the research outcome, I would like to talk today about the research process itself, as it pertains to memory works. Let me start with a note on anthropology of elites. In 1972, the great dame of anthropology and my mentrix, Laura Nader, wrote an article entitled Up the Anthropologist, Perspectives from Studying Up. In it, she urged anthropologists to study the middle and upper social structure as well as the lower. Anthropologists have much to contribute to an understanding of the processes whereby power is exercised. Indeed, there is a certain urgency to this kind of anthropology. The consequences of not studying up as well as down are serious in terms of developing an adequate theory and description. This sentiment was slowly echoed by others. A decade later, Crapanzano, another important anthropologist, wrote, and I quote, "I had discovered that even in the research on domination, most anthropologists had never bothered to study the dominant. They had only studied the dominated, and from that perspective described the structure of domination." But how do we study up? And what are the challenges and pitfalls of such a study? Well, the first thing is opportunity. So apart from a well-honed research apparatus, conducting research requires capturing an opportune moment, especially so when a great deal of the outcome is based on memory. There are times when those who went through traumatic events are silent or silenced. And there are times when they were willing to share their experiences. My father never spoke to us, his children, about the war, perhaps because the memories were too painful, or perhaps he didn't think we would understand. The Holocaust survivors were silent for decades. What applies to individuals applies to entire communities. If there is no audience, people remain silent. I had the good luck of turning my interest from the issue of disintegration of social structures, my previous study on nomadic communities in the Middle East, to the subject of their durability at the right moment. My attention turned to the Polish gentry. In the aftermath of 1989, the year that marked the fall of communism, the gentry, both aristocrats and the lesser nobility, experienced a surge of popularity, quickly re-emerging as significant political and cultural actors in post-communist Poland. Families that were historically privileged and later discriminated against during the communist epoch appeared to be re-entering the pre-communist social trajectory, from which they were temporarily derailed by the historical episode of communism. With each consecutive visit to Poland, I found more books on the market, some written by the gentry and some about them. They multiplied with a daunting speed: sepia color albums, gentry registries, genealogies of aristocratic families, histories of noble houses, who is who in the past and the present, and above all, memoirs of all kinds. It seemed that everyone was engaged in this business of reminiscing. The fascination of the public with everything noble appeared insatiable at that time. The gentry, who suddenly became visible, were almost giddy with delight. Put on the public stage again, they resurrected relics of their former lifestyle. There were noble balls, St. Hubert's Day, foxhounds, and glamorous weddings, the splendor of which equaled royal ceremonies in Western Europe. Obituaries began to specify titles and former possessions. The Order of Malta reconferred new members. Within a few years, no less than 4 journals appeared on the market, all explicitly catering to the Gentry's interests. Finally, at least 2 Gentry organizations came back to life. My question thus became, how did the Polish Gentry manage to persist and reproduce itself in a hostile political environment, void of its former means of existence? What strategies did they historically develop in order to maintain group identity and cohesiveness? Which properties and attributes facilitated their transformation into a meaningful category of the new post-socialist social structure? When the research inquired into the processes of elite reproduction, it also asked a larger question of features, constituents of social groups and societies, which allow them or not to endure over long periods in history across various political and social regimes. So what are the elites and how do we study them? The early scholars of elites followed the theory of Pareto and Mosca developed during the late 19th and 20th centuries and defined elites as organized ruling groups. Henceforth, the study of elites became synonymous with the study of power structures. A considerable body of social research was dedicated to the circulation, reproduction, and regime discontinuities. In treating all elites as they were political elites, the early scholarship defined them primarily as organizations and institutions. The focus shifted later to advanced capitalist society and even larger units of analysis, national, transnational, and cosmopolitan, which shift replaced an earlier view of political elites as corporate bodies and introduced a model of elites as an informal organization bound by shared interest and culture. As pointed out by Giddens, in advanced capitalist societies that advocate pluralism, leadership is exercised by amorphous and differentiated groups rather than by a monolithic social entity. Such conceptual revision allowed for the inclusion of any group of significance and influence in a given society, be it religious, economic, social, cultural, or noble. Elite has gained a new vigor since the publication of illuminating work of Bourdieu in 1984, so a while ago, on elite formation and modes of domination in France. Most scholars agree now that at the heart of elite existence is the concept of social distinction. The real implication of power is that elites have a life and share a knowledge system that clearly separates them from other people. This way of life, or habitus, as he named it, is a set of acquired schemata, sensibilities, dispositions, and tastes that emerge from historically formed structural conditions. Habitus is thus a means by which social distinction is produced and social hierarchy kept intact, a process that is as profound as it is unnoticed. This approach became very helpful in the study of Gentry. The next point I would like to address is access and agendas. I like my little titles. It is the very nature of elites to be exclusive and inaccessible. Indeed, the aura of mystique and inherent worthiness which surrounds them is predicated upon it, and the reluctance to engage in commonplace interlocution constitutes a boundary marker. This is particularly true of hereditary elites, and above all, nobility, among whom kinship, descent, shared essence, and the power derived from their place in history provide a basis for exclusivity, which makes the line that divides those who are in and those who are out rigid. Yet there is a certain vagueness about them, never flashy, always low-key, They create an impression of easiness and informality and still remain just slightly unattainable, producing sort of a glass door effect. Performance here, of course, is of essence. Just as a habit of servitude is incorporated in the behavior of a servile group by way of their own body deportment, so is the habit of superiority among the elite. A noble incarnates embodied authority, and more importantly, does it not by mechanically executing codes, but by the ease of practiced performance. Whether the elites cultivate such a demeanor and the effect is premeditated, or whether the reactions of the outsiders are formed by their own class perceptions of self, their stance creates an obstacle to interaction. Since structures of authority and prestige are embedded in all members of the collective social body, Herzfeld's analogy to bureaucracy is instructive here. If there are no clients to affirm their superiority, he writes, that superiority has no grounds. Consequently, a considerable attention in the literature on elite studies is paid to methodological difficulties in accessing elites. This was not my experience, possibly because Polish nobles were, in some respect, different. They were once a large and powerful force that formed the nation's core and shaped its identity, perhaps to a greater extent than their counterparts in other European countries. But their fortunes waned, and the socialist regimes make them disappear from the public forum. Forced into silence for more than a half century, they had a powerful need to tell their story. Most importantly, I fitted into their current agenda. Heavily relying on the discourse of victimization privileged after 1989, Gentry advocated reservation of the group in the public sphere, recognition of injustices inflicted upon them, and most importantly, called for a revision of the land reform. Reprivatization high on the national agenda, they lobbied for the return of the property, unlawfully also argued, seized from them. The subject proved to be more controversial than the Gentry had expected. Not surprisingly, peasants and parties that represented them rejected the proposal. In an effort to deal with the resistance, Gentry's representatives reduced the request to what in the land reform parlor became known as residuaries, mainly manors and parks which surround them. Since these have been converted into recreational, scientific, or housing facilities, the request put their former owners in the direct conflict with those agencies and local population that made use of them. This created a situation in which Gentry became willing and even eager interlocutors who used the interviews as an opportunity to voice their views, rectify the negative image constructed of them by the communist propaganda, and set their personal and collective record straight. Thus, nobility were willing to speak. And so the problem was not gaining access to informants, but the fact they were telling the same story. What would have, under other circumstances, generated enthusiasm made me wonder. Contrary to the practice of community-oriented anthropology, when oftentimes ethnographers become spokespersons on behalf of the community they study, the challenge was to resist their agendas. This is not to say that pursuing own agendas, controlling information, and possibly affecting the research program is a unique situation. What is striking about the Gentry and what sets them apart is their belief in the inherent worthiness of the story they are willing to share, in comparison to the cautious attitude I often encountered in my previous fieldwork. This is perhaps indirectly related to power. If one can control the story, its content flow, and ultimately its uses, she is less vulnerable than those who have no such capability. Furthermore, the willingness to impart one's life story is related to the belief in the inherent value of that story. The higher position one presumes in the social structure, the more conviction this belief assumes. Now I would like to address what I call ethnographic seduction. It is common in elite studies, and so I did. I pursued what is called appointment anthropology. The Gentry are a dispersed community forming no residential group. To my surprise, aristocrats, descendants of titled families with old genealogies, were easiest to approach. First, they had become visible through the media coverage. Secondly, their historically high profile prompted an instantaneous name recognition, while names of less distinguished gentry might not to be immediately identified as noble. If one met a Radziwiłł, one knew it and was smug to point it out. Also, Polish aristocracy prided itself on the commitment and service to the country, and perhaps also for this reason they appeared amiable to granting interviews. Conversely, petty gentry were more difficult to trace and less eager to relate their experiences. The more information they revealed of themselves, the more apparent became their minor position in the gentry's hierarchy. As one of the consequences of socialist era was leveling of the entire group, it was to their benefit to gloss over their particular social standing. Conversations took place in gentry's own environment, be it an apartment or a house, mostly in the urban metropole. They were distinct in their location, usually in parts of the city that were fortunate to survive the ravages of war. The buildings retained at least some of their former elegance, which set them apart from the impersonal concrete and steel high-rises of socialist apartment blocks. Each interview was taped, transcribed, and if requested, also authorized. Given the forum, gentry were in control of the content of the conversation, the story, and the message they wanted to impart. In effect, they were directing the show to which I was an audience. Because of the subject matter and the duration of the interview, conversations were emotionally and physically taxing. Nonetheless, even the eldest of them, and many were of advanced age, demonstrated great presence, clarity of mind, and a remarkable endurance, on occasion greater than mine. It was hard not to be impressed by their stamina on the one hand and their ambience of the residents on the other. Unintentionally, this registered in the written text because, as one of the readers of my manuscript remarked, I seemed to be in awe of nobility. My interlocutors were, with no exception, charming, intelligent, cultured people, bearing unmistakable marks of gentry's habitus. Many were gifted storytellers, some had charismatic personalities. Some stories were mesmerizing because they were colorful, hilarious, or disturbing. The emotional appeal of a powerful story told by a talented narrator may lead to the trap of ethnographic seduction. A complex dynamic of conscious and unconscious moves that may arise in interviews and prevent interviewers from probing the discourse of the interviewee and might make them lose their critical stance towards the manifest discourse. Developed by Robin in relationship to his work with victims and perpetrators of extreme violence in Argentina, this concept also is applicable to the ethnographic study of elites. Impartiality or partiality, so to say, is another issue that I would like to address. Yet another problem is that of the researchers' expected empathy and partiality. Elite research requires normative distancing beyond the usual relativism, and even then it occurs in an ideologically charged atmosphere. Empathy for interlocutors as individuals and as members of a larger body, which is normally taken for granted, becomes problematic in the study of elite groups, especially if it is a study of elite in the ethnographer's home society. The interview situation, the characters of my visits, the nature of reminiscences about lives sketched with broad strokes and shared with a stranger, all were not conducive to establishing intimate relations with the informants and did indeed not yield any beyond some sympathies and some antipathies. I empathize with the traumas brought by the war, dispossession, and displacement. I felt saddened by individual tragedies that befell many and was touched by the aging figures in the midst of spaces crowded with objects of the past, their hands shaking while drinking tea from precious china cups. But I was also irritated by their unyielding claim over the definition of Polishness. Some statements made me wince. Although I could understand the dilemmas of the Gentry, I was troubled by the request for reprivatization and found ideological differences difficult to overcome. My fieldwork experience showed that the task of relativizing poses a special challenge when one is subject to the same structures governing inclusion and exclusion. Even if empathy does not become a personal problem for the ethnographer, and she manages to suspend normative judgment, reactions of the readers are nonetheless just as likely to be normatively based. And compassion for one's subjects might be misconstrued as ideological sympathy, or, as it was in my case, the awe of or enchantment with nobility. Consequently, more so than in other studies, the art of research of elites lies in being able to convey the humanity of individual experience without falling into the methodological traps of the hidden agendas that the elites pursue. In order to escape the enchantment of their habitus, anthropological detachment is more necessary here than in other ethnographic engagements. Charm is socially constructed, but it is also a strategy and a tool of power. Doubtless, working not primarily as an observer of people who were living their lives, so to say, but rather as an interlocutor with people who were deliberately telling their stories, helped to shape the research process and the conclusion I was able to draw. Although the lack of personal attachment was in some ways limiting, it was also advantageous. It allowed, for instance, to spot inconsistencies embedded in self-reported accounts that challenge their eyewitness status. The tension between self-reported stories and detached analysis present in traditional anthropology is of equal concern in the study of elites and any powerful group, despite the absence of a personal relation between the researcher and the research subject that seems to have the potential of obstructing scientific rigor. I would like to turn, I don't know how I'm doing with time. I'm doing well, okay. Turn attention, I hope I'm not boring you, to the subject of memory and memory works and how do we address these. Well, obviously, life stories rely on memory. Gentry's accounts of their lives were striking by precision and vividness of recollection. In listening to memories of land reform, which took place 50 years ago, I was impressed by how fresh they appeared, how rich in minuscule details. This made me eager to believe that they were obviously authentic and accurate. Memories inspire faith because we believe they were recorded at the time. They have an eyewitness status. Yet it has been shown through research into autobiographical memory that despite the vividness of our memory of momentous events, our recall of the actual facts of the event and the circumstances we were in at the time is often incorrect. Neither the vividness of a memory nor the strength of our certainty in a memory can ensure its veracity. Generally, memory is taken to mean the processes by which events are coded and recalled. The simplicity of this definition obscures the complexity of the problem. It becomes increasingly apparent that memory is not a record of the past, but its reconstruction. An act of retelling, a complex work of interpretation. What is remembered is not only retrieval of stored information, but also a representation of the self then and the self now, which occurs in a culturally contextualized social interaction. Furthermore, ever since Holbach's seminal work on collective memory, it has been stressed that individual memory is not simply personal. Typically, our memories are mixed, possessing both a personal and a social aspect. This presents us with a perplexing paradox that the memory of an individual, precisely that which is taken to epitomize individuality, draws upon collective idioms and mechanisms. Our memories are embedded in social, cultural, and historical contexts. Indeed, even the very process of remembering personally significant events and situations depends upon cultural and historical practices for remembering and creating meaning. The fundamental question in the study of memory is how does autobiographical memory become transferred into collective memory and collective representation of the past? How is the collective memory tableau created? What social mechanisms shape the processes of memory making, and what are the means through which a group establishes memory of the collective past? What then are the distinctive features of autobiographical narrative and collective memory of which we must be aware when consulting such documents? First, the story as told. Well, memories are contaminated with information from similar events and change over the years. They are vivid, at least partially, because they are told, retold, and affirmed by the similarity of stories told by other people whose experiences, while not identical, were comparable. Shared memories and the sharing process itself, or the production of spoken or written narratives about the past, take form within the framework of meaning assigned by the group within which they are told. Social groups construct their own images of the world by establishing an agreed version of the past, a version that is established not by private remembrance, but by communication. That's also Holbach's. Second, memory making mediates the identity of people. Recalled experiences and shared images of the past have particular importance for the constitution and reconstitution of social groups in the present. After the land reform and traumatic circumstances attending it, the identity of the gentry was sustained through repetitive telling of the story of the expropriation they endured. Though these were individual events, they eventually merged into a master story that became the group's commemoration of the past. This collective narrative serves as a means to validate the truth and is an important site in the struggle for moral accountability in relation to the state from which they demanded justice, public exoneration and redemption, as well as economic compensation. In this fashion, the gentry constitute a mnemonic community, a community that comprises those who, while communicating with each other, remember together experiences of which they were victims. Yet they do so in a patterned way that is shaped by social difference. The gentry remember only a fraction of reality, the grim aspects of manorial life, those dealing with peasant hardship, poverty, illiteracy, and in many cases the appalling living conditions of estate workers, which all had been part of their experience, simply vanish or form what is called paled memory. If absorbed by memory, they rarely appear in the act of retelling. And if they do so in a relativized and historicized form. While telling and retelling selected parts of a shared past, the gentry condemned to oblivion other parts of the same shared past. In this process, they tried to establish control over memory and thus history of certain events, and so to legitimize actions of the group in the past and in the present. Although the gentry privilege remembering over forgetting in the belief of reclaiming history, there is no immaculate experience undistorted by culture that lies at the foundation of memory. While social memory shapes and potentially distorts memory, while social identity shapes and potentially distorts memory, so does the intense sense of loss. The sense of tragic loss colors the personal as well as collective memories of the gentry and makes it difficult to separate what they had really felt from the cosmetic retouching of subsequent experience. Through the act of remembering, they mourn the passing of an era and their own childhood and youth. Yearning for a lost home, cultural milieu, and a past experience are mixed with the bitterness of rejection and expulsion. Memory, and the memory of childhood in particular, is a trickster that twists reality and dupes us into believing in vague, distant, and yet comforting images of home, which then seem large and life uncomplicated. Home, which in the eyes of a child appeared as the source of ultimate good, warmth, and security, becomes idealized in the memory of an adult and mythologized in the memory of the next generation. In a fashion, we are taught to remember the past, or rather particular fragments of it. Parents mark and then contextualize what is important for their children to remember. By living in a house filled with objects of the past, looking at the family album, a portrait gallery, or visiting a graveyard, the gentry's children become aware of how their own private past converges with that of the family, the country, and bygone times in general. But this is not, nor can it be, more than approximation of what has transpired. As we have seen, collective memory is often selective, distorted, and inaccurate. It tends to simplify, exaggerate, and deny ambiguity and complexity. It continuously negotiates between available historical records and current social and political agendas, selectively emphasizing, suppressing, and elaborating different aspects of those records in the process. What we remember about an event depends on when and for what purpose we are remembering. Hence, it is important to take into account the socio-political conditions under which stories surface and the narrative and rhetorical conventions that affect them. In forging links of continuity between past and present, memory operates most frequently by means of threads of a narrative. The relationship between experience and narrative, between narrating self and the narrated self, is dialectical. People emerge from and are products of their stories about themselves as much as their stories emerge from their lives. The life history as life story, in the very literal meaning and narration, has to be told by the individual in order to understand who the self is, and in order to understand the world as it happened to him or her. Thus, autobiography is an interpretive, open process of becoming that is dialogical as well as reconstructive. We reconstruct our lives looking back at what we went through, looking forward to what we aspire to, putting it together for actual purposes. We produce ourselves. The story we put together is a story, but it doesn't mean that anything can go in it. The life story depends on a life history, which in turn is placed at the interstices of the individual and the social context in which the person existed. Hence, all Gentry stories are extraordinary and yet strangely typical, gripping and yet predictable. They form and follow a master narrative that was reproduced so many times that it becomes a code of communication within a community. Indeed, repetition is essential to the establishment of life story as history. Although memory is capable of great plasticity, it can also become fixed or conventionalized through the process of retelling and the particular narrative form used. Some culturally provided genres of narrative, some invocation of memory, some subject positions are more enabling or disabling in certain contexts than others. Another means of memory works are memoirs. In contrast to the poor, elites have a long tradition of biography, and their members are in the habit of writing memoirs towards the end of their lives. The annals of the underclasses are short and simple because they leave little record or have no one to write for them. No family trees, no obituaries, heirlooms, or even wills worth mentioning. The gentry, on the other hand, are prolific memoirists, having taken advantage of a literacy that enables one to articulate history. They wrote for perpetuity. For generations that would follow them. In periods of repression, they wrote to counteract what was written about them and to fill blanks in the official history. Often, individual gentry state explicitly that they write for their children, grandchildren, and their children to teach and to remember. And yet these accounts, ostensibly written for private family use, were not a private matter at all, for the simple reason that the gentry never conceived of their lives as private. The gentry did not stop writing under any circumstances, truly believing it to be their duty to serve as the witness to history and the chronicler of the times. They kept writing after the war and their expropriation, and such was their conviction of the importance of their writing that they deposited manuscripts in the national archives and libraries. Thus, they joined a long line of gentry memoirists who produced works of various historical and literary value, only some of whom were affecting and talented writers. The practice derived from the conviction that their lives were worth remembering because they have been of importance, and from the sense that their position had exerted influence. The decisions made by them change part of their social world. The personal history, so to speak, of the memoir writer is intertwined with the objective history embodied in institutions they were able to transform, modify, even overthrow, be it a political system, a method of governance, or administration of an estate or a program of education. Their confidence in the social significance of their lives sometimes could be substantiated and sometimes was merely illusionary. But it is this perceived capacity of making an impact that enables the writers to conceive of their lives retrospectively and merge their individual life histories with the course of greater history. The sense of relevance is shaped by the notion of legitimating origins and the power of descent that propels them into imagining their lives as worth remembering. The Gentry wrote what they thought was worth knowing about them. This was also what they wanted to be known about them. Hence, their memoirs are a highly censored account of their lives, and in a sense, impersonal. They wrote the good memories, the memories they wanted to save from forgetting, and in the process produced the image they desired. So memoirs are simultaneously a record, even if tainted, a moral document, and an agenda for the future. Even when the writings take place in the form of a diary, it still bears marks of a diligent censor, as if the act of writing was public and its very nature excluded privacy. Thus, while authentic, the memoirs lack authenticity. Decorum forbidding unnecessary displays of emotion, the Gentry writing genre is severely lacking in description of the intimate sphere. The publication of the only memoir that disclosed the private suffering of family members due to alcoholism, bad marriage, infidelity, or parental indifference scandalized the Gentry community and expelled its author from the family association. Tarnowski's work was an attempt at an honest, uncleansed portrayal of his family life, but it also revealed his kin as ordinary people who do not necessarily meet the standards of exemplary behavior. And most important, it breached the code of silence. The Gentry are protective of their image. They are mindful of exposing any personal matter to public scrutiny. Indeed, most narratives focus on facts and accuracy of details in material and social domains. Thus, we become acquainted with the minutiae of estate management, intricate techniques of hunting, personalities encounter, complexities of making a trip to a city or traveling abroad, but in general, coming and going of various people, but learn little about their inner lives. In these conventionalized, seemingly scripted Gentry life stories, written or told, the similitude of biographical accounts is produced by thematic borrowing and idiomatic memory recall. The one, what I call the one suitcase trope, is such a recurring motive. The Gentry commonly claimed that at the time of expropriation, they were allowed to leave their landed estates with only one suitcase. Although this story is historically substantiated only in a few cases, it serves as a metaphor that captures the drama of dispossession and expulsion and allows the storyteller to establish commonality of experience. In similar fashion, people remember discrimination in the following period. Although they might not have experienced it personally, the theme is appropriated from the experience of others and incorporated into personal story as part of a collective discourse. This allows every Gentry, a member of the Gentry, to claim discrimination at university admission without actually having experienced it. In fact, education was an important means of capital conversion, and almost all Gentry made sure to educate their children. What does all this mean for the researcher who's relying substantially on first-person narratives to tell a story of Gentry culture and strategies? How do we access informant statements when so much of the evidence, how do we assess informant statements when so much of the evidence on which we must depend comes from self-interested first-person narratives. It must be kept in mind that narratives are statements about the ideologies and values of their producers, who created them to inform posterity and to exert influence on how history is written, even from beyond the grave. Hence, the values of memoirs, just like that of memory, is of restricted use to a researcher, underscoring a tension between what actually happened and the received narratives about the past. The process of adjusting the fit is an ongoing one, subject to continual debate and exchanges, in which memory and history may play shifting, alternatively more or less contentious role in setting the record straight. Thus, all sources are to a degree faulty, memory malleable, memoirs self-serving, interviews projecting a particular image. Any attempt at historical representation must take into account the subjectivity of those who made the records, written or oral, and the role of memory, along with other problems associated with such a record of the past. So, while each source is only of potential value, together they provide a picture of the past through the Gentry, the slide is like in my eyes, through the Gentry experience of the past 70 years, which had seen the war, the land reform, the repression, the stability, and finally the demise of communist ideology and state power, with the corollary impetus to rewrite and reclaim history. The mnemonic presence of the past takes many forms and serves many purposes, ranging from conscious recall to unreflected re-emergence, from nostalgic longing for what is lost to polemical use of the past to reshape the present, and from performance in rituals to habituated body conduct. Whichever the case might be, the interaction between present and past is the stuff of cultural memory, is the product of collective agency rather than the result of psychological act or historical accident. The value of narratives resides in the fact that they reveal not just an interested account of what happened, but a glimpse of the ideology at work in the way the story is crafted. In its very slant, the narrative itself tells us about Gentry attitudes and habitus. Therefore, we must be conscious of the hazards of working with memory artifacts and narratives, and move between two highly subjective sources. The bias inherent in personal history, woven into a collective master story, and the rhetoric of impersonal documents. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have the opportunity to discuss this brilliant lecture. Please ask your questions. I'm a little bit blended.
We are blinded here by the lights.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No questions.
Yes.
Oh, you hear me?
Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for this presentation. My name is Sofia Chuikina. My research is about Russian nobility, but I work in France. I'm from French University. My first question I would like to ask if this story is contested, because your Polish nobility have written memoirs, told their stories in the 90s. They wanted to tell the truth as they thought, impose their vision of history, of course. But then, first of all, there is a new generation, let's say their children, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, how they perceive this story. Do they contest it? Because it seems to be so positive. And also other readers, other people who have access to this story or history. So do they or comment on it or react to it? So this is my first question. Second question I would like to know is whether for you elite and declassed elite is the same thing, because like this is the elite that lost their richness, and so do we study it in the same way? And like one last very small question, you said that there is a good moment to study elite. Like you said, in the beginning of the 90s, this was a very good moment. And of course, I agree. And that is why, luckily, we have many publications about different countries, because we managed in the 90s to take some interviews and so on. So now it is done. So what will be with our field? Because the generation that had something interesting to tell, it is gone. So how you see the future of our field?
Well, honestly, I hope that papers that will follow will tell us about the children of those whom I have interviewed, because I have not. But as I was saying, once this mastered story is formed, it continues in the present and in the future. So I assume, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the story of, let's say, expropriation and the trauma of land reform told by the grandparents will be told in the same fashion by the grandchildren. This is the nature of collective memory, right? So we establish some way of remembering and of retelling, and we continue doing so. But I don't know, maybe the audience can answer better the question about what is the third and fourth generation take on expropriation, let's say. I didn't quite understand the question about elite and class, the difference between elites and class elite. Oh, declassation. Never thought about declassation, essentially, maybe because for the gentry it was illusionary declassation. They never were declassed. They were declassed in an official way, but we know there was this duality of life in all socialist countries, the private and the official ideology. So the point I'm trying to do to make in my book is that indeed about how it is possible that social groups, being an elite group of any kind, can reproduce itself, not in the same fashion. Obviously, the gentry today doesn't have noble estates, or very few of them would. But how do they transform themselves into being a meaningful category, and yet a category? We still talk about the gentry. If they were declassed and they disappeared, we wouldn't be talking about them right now. So, and elite, I agree, elite is very sort of a tricky concept because it's so hard to define. So I'm not sure how to answer this question. I never thought that they were declassed. And again, please, the audience may have expressed opinion on this subject. I'm not sure I answered the question. This is the best I could do.
We have some questions. Please introduce
I got the microphone first, yes. My name is Silke Marburg from Dresden, and you named in the beginning of your lecture Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, as one of the...
Louder.
Yeah, I trust to the microphone. Oh, yes, thank you very much. In the beginning of your lecture, you named Pierre Bourdieu as one of the inspirations, theoretical inspirators. And so I can be sure that you are coming with a work of Monique de Saint-Martin, yes, and Les Bas de la Noblesse. And it's very close to your setting, to your approach, so to say, but to complete other nobilities, so to say. And this comparison seems very interesting to my mind because she draws the attention to one point of her interlocutors when they point out that they themselves not at all live as nobles. And yes, it's a little bit astonishing point that they can tell much about their memories and the collective memory and the memory of their families. But most of the interlocutors point out that they themselves, if you ask them so personally, no, I'm not a noble, I'm not living so. And the question is, how is it with your interlocutors? How think they about their lives? Do they live in a noble way? And that could be a small piece to think about the ethnological seduction. So, if you get what I mean.
As it happened, I know a number of French aristocracy members, and as it's quite common to say, is this you are a noble. You are embodiment of nobility. It doesn't mean that you have to have all the accoutrements. It doesn't mean that you have to have horses in your stable or go hunting and so on, although they do. You simply are. That's the whole point about this belief in one's specialty, sort of being a special person. You are a noble. I mean, the Polish gentry, and they were impoverished after the war. But they could eat potatoes, as I heard in stories, they could eat potatoes for dinner and nothing else. But they had to eat it in a proper fashion, with a fork and a knife, let's say. That is the essence of nobility. And the fact that we're expropriated, of course, it was tragic and so on, but it didn't change anything in their inner belief in this inherent value of being a noble. Am I answering your question? So the question is, what is a noble way of life? It's not about a way of life. It's about who you are and who you are recognized as such. Am I?
Okay, I have a question. I do appreciate, Anna Vloga, Polish Academy of Sciences. I do appreciate the fact that you let us on the backstage of your research, and I like very much the notion of the anthropological seduction. But my question is about the afterlife of your research. Because when I read your book a couple of years ago, at the beginning of my own research, I was all the time wondering whether you get any kind of feedback from your interviewees. Because having the experience of interviewing people myself, I know that people tend to reveal a lot of information, and you tend to build a very intimate relationship with your interviewee. So there is this matter of trust, intimate trust between interviewer and interviewee. So after or maybe whether they read your book, after they read your book, did you get the kind of feedback? So you misunderstood us, you understood us well. What were the reactions, if there were any?
It's interesting. I got many requests by the children of those whom I interviewed for the tapes, because many of them have passed already away, and transcript of an interview is different than hearing the voice, and voice is supposedly is one of those first things that go after somebody has died, if we forget the voice. So it was important for them to hear the voice of the beloved one. Otherwise, I don't have no idea who read it in Poland. I mean, the book received quite a bit of attention in anthropological circles abroad, lots of reviews, and pretty positive, I have to say. It was never translated into Polish. I think there is one copy at the university library. That's about it. So I never got any response, which was puzzling. I think it's a good question. Why not? And I'm not sure that I can answer this question.
Just a follow-up comment, because I mean, my book was not about the gentry at large, but I got like multiple comments. You were wrong. You were totally wrong. You were right. You were very right. We are grateful. We hate you. I mean, spanning from this to that.
But
maybe it was a matter of the language.
I don't know. I don't know if the gentry read the book. I never heard anything from them. Really. I mean, I heard from my Bedouin informants. I mean, they would tell me all the time about how wrong I was and I didn't get it, this and this. But I never heard from the gentry. So what does it tell us?
Let me come here. I'm Cesar Luszyński. I'm a historian by education, diplomat by profession, and descendant of two gentry families, both in paternal and maternal line. I would like to contribute to one of the questions on behalf of a lady on the top of the audience. This one on elites and declassed elites. It's maybe all about perception, my own perception, the colleagues who are part of the audience here. But you know, we might be deprived of everything: property, houses, art, books. Just be, clerks or teachers or doctors in the city. You've got more, your suitcase and not much more. But we still be elite. I mean, you can't take out of this. I mean, no social revolution, no communist role could have deprived us of the pride of our ancestors and the sense of responsibility, even for the peasants around who might have murdered your father and expelled your mother with small children from the house. Maine. I belong to the generation whose parents were born in Mainers. And we, along with the colleagues here, we've got a lot of older friends who were born in Mainers. I mean, and they cherish their memories. We cherish their memories because they contribute to our own identity. And in a society which is post-communist, obviously, we are a democratic society. But you must remember that democracy is not the concept that would be ideal for landed gentry or aristocracy. By definition, I mean, it's something we have to live with, respect, but it's democracy. It's a popular rule. Thank you.
It was more comment than the question. Please.
Thank you. My name is Mikołaj Getka-Kenik, and I'm professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences, Institute for the History of Science. And I would like to ask you about the memories of people who were and are descendants of the landed class, but they are also members of families, or they married into families of different background, because it wasn't actually a rare situation when people, so children of landowners, actually they had wives or husbands of peasant or middle class background. And my question is about the influence of this differentiated family connections on their memories of and on their identity, on their identification with their noble background.
I can't answer this question, I'm sorry, because my research concerned the Gentry. And one of the strategies of survival and continuity was marriage within the group. So in a great majority, and I cannot tell you right now the percentage, the Gentry married other Gentry. And of course, there were exceptions. I just heard yesterday that my great-grandmother was hrabianka. God only knows, it disappeared in the family history somehow. So obviously there was intermarriage, there was historical intermarriage, especially in the 19th century, with Jewish community as well. But that was not the subject of my research. From sort of anecdotal evidence that I have among my friends, and it is stated. My father was a peasant from, and my wife's descent is this and this. So there is a consciousness of difference. Not that it influenced the marital relationships, but there is a consciousness of we come from different sort of backgrounds. This is the best I can answer.
Well, one more question, please.
По-англійську, по-польську, то добре, по-англійську. Thank you so much for your excellent report. I would like just to ask you, what do you think about an application of Pierre Nora's conception for the study of social memory of former aristocracy in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in former Rzeczpospolita? I ask you because I myself came from a frontier area of former Rzeczpospolita, centered around Nesvizh, Slonim, Novogrudek. It's now in Western Belarus, but it was ex-Poland before the war. I ask you because there are a lot of traces of aristocratic memories in our area. Aristocratic memories in the area around Nesvizh are very persistent. It concerns not only those of the house of Radziwill, but also of local nobility. There are a lot of dozens, even more place names around Nesvizh and my native Kletsk. I came from Kletsk, from a Radzivillian estate, and a lot, dozens of sites of memory, not only of the house of Radziwill, but of also those of lesser nobility. It's something like a treasure, landscape, topography local. It's a treasure, not only archives. I'm also an archivist by education, but also I'm interested in spatial dimensions of aristocratic memories. So what do you think about a use of Pierre Nora conception concerning the study of social memory of former aristocracy? Maybe not former, also existent, but because their descendants are still alive in our society. Thank you so much for your answer.
Well,
sorry for my English.
I don't know how to answer this. I don't know what would be. It's just a little contribution that I made in the world of anthropology and social science. what I think the fact that there are these sites of memory that are cultivated is a statement about the importance of that history of the place and the place that the gentry and nobility played in history. That's all I can say.
I think we have questions from
the online participation, and it's from Hannah Well, and I record that. What are the possibilities of opting out from being noble and renouncing this identity? Have you come across individuals and their families who attempted this?
Rejecting your own nobility. Tricky question. You don't reject your familiar history. You might disagree with the ideology that they produced in the past. And indeed, as we have seen in 1980s, the gentry were very active in democratization of the country. And they were taking place in the opposition. So it doesn't mean that they wanted to return to the lifestyle that existed before, which became obviously not possible. The lifestyle could only exist within a particular social historical formation. And that formation disappeared. But it didn't change the essence of I already spoke of it, of that inherent belief in being a noble, of acting like a noble without the accoutrements of material support of it. So yes, many gentry were very democratic in the later period, but it doesn't mean I did not, and maybe you would know, that ever somebody said, I'm not, I don't know, mention some name anymore. They may have rejected the historical record of the family, and they might choose different ideology that would drive them into the future and making a different contribution to the country. But rejecting nobility, I have not come across.
Small comment of mine. In Germany, it costs a lot to reject own nobility. In Germany, you have the aristocratic or noble titles still. Title, yeah. And to resign of title is a complicated and operation.
No, but we didn't have that system, right? Yeah, so there are no titles, or very few had titles. So it's, as I said, noble is who you are. Okay.
One more question.
Yes.
Or there is no the gentleman here. Oh, sorry, I'm blind.
Good morning, and thank you for your lecture. And my name is Piedra Solans. I come from Spain, and I live in Berlin. And I am a doctor in... I am a doctor in history, and I write a book about the phenomenology of memory, our understanding of memory from our present in Germany and in Poland, also in Spain. And for me, there is no doubt that there is a language, a narration about memory according to social groups and their interest to legitimize or to give meaning to their experience. But for me, it's very important also about to research in the silence of the perpetrators, silence of the victims many times, because the experience was very, very traumatic, to speak about the trauma. But regarding to the aristocracy, do you think that there is any doubt that they legitimize their genealogies, they have to reconstruct this link in time, and to to perpetuate their genealogies, and they won't renounce to it. But what is about silence in the aristocracy? What do they hide? What do they hide? What do they don't say? I mean, language is very interesting, and when it's filled with meaning, but what is not said is also very interesting to me.
Absolutely. Actually, the first draft title of my book was supposed to be Noble Silences. But somebody pointed to me, gosh, they talk a lot, you know. But indeed, it was about that silence that surrounded them for 50 years, and then suddenly it was broken and they could speak. But the problem for a research, of course, is how do we study silence? If nobody talks, what do we know? How do we approach that? But the silences that I have encountered in their accounting of their lives as life stories, let's say, or memoirs in whatever form, have to do, which I already had to say, there's a difference between, I didn't talk about it, there's a gender difference. About the memoirs written by women and by men. Women are much more evocative about the feelings. They would speak about the children who fell ill, while men would be rather silent about this matter. They were busy with the more public life. So there are differences. But I was struck, indeed, by how little do I really learn about these people who had the conviction that they should communicate with us, with the future, right? Or even contemporaries, and yet they were hiding so much, because I didn't learn very much about who they were as people. So absolutely, it's a great question, but by absence, we learn something as well. So absence of a narrative about this inner life and failures, about, life as we live as people. We fall, we get up, we fall in love, our hearts are broken. I mean, things happen. None of it is in this record of their lives. So as I said, they're obviously authentic, and they are not at the same time, because they reveal what they want to reveal, and they hide a great deal about who they are and how life was or is. So yeah, good question. But absence of information is also information. For us as researchers, I think.
Thank you very much. Please.
Is it enough? Yes. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm István Kollai from Hungary, but I work at the Comenius University in Bratislava, so I represent here in Slovakia. And I enjoyed really your presentation. It was very useful and helpful for me. And my question is, what do you think about the generalization of these conclusions or experiences, what you could find in Poland? Because as I listened to your lecture, I think there were many frames which could be totally implemented to the, for instance, to the Hungarian situation or society. Meanwhile, maybe there are differences too. For instance, I don't know, I really don't know the situation in Poland, how, for instance, these gentry families escaped to a kind of immigration. Because in Hungary, yes, so most of my interviews which I made, I had to make abroad. So in the uprising in 1956, 200,000 people fled to the west. So it made, for instance, this embeddedness of the memory of this sphere or social sphere, which you call here gentry, not so strongly embedded into the Hungarian society. So maybe it would be interesting to see this kind of parallels and and differences too. Thank you.
I'm not sure what the question is.
The question is about the possibility of generalization of this experience. For instance, noble people remain noble. For instance, in Hungary, there was a very strong oppression to underclass these people. For instance, my grandparents couldn't move back to Budapest, they couldn't have a flat and so on. So there was a very strong social deprivation. So I couldn't say, for instance, in Hungary that we could speak about some kind of marriage within a kind of post-Gentry society, something like that.
Well, obviously, every life is different and people choose different things. Now, some of the Polish gentry left indeed the country, probably in 1939, the very beginning of the war, and then stayed there. And it happened very often that in gentry, large family, because they are huge, since they count family as a very large unit, there would be someone who lives abroad. And that was part of the, it was very helpful for those who remain. So this continuing cosmopolitan networks was important for generally as a strategy of survival, not that it was necessarily conscious strategy. But most of the Polish gentry and nobility stayed in the country. What set them apart right after the war, but right after the war, that was not the worst period of discrimination against the gentry. It's only started in 1950s. So although gentry were expropriated, they were in some fashion needed for the new regime to run the country. Now let's face it, nobody had experience except for the gentry. They were the literate. They were running manorial estates for a long time. They spoke various languages and so on and so on. So and that's the whole chapter of the book, indeed, how important this first post-war period, apart from the expropriation, and that also went in some cases in stages, how important the gentry were for, that's paradox, for the establishment of the new administration in socialist Poland. Because they had the skills that nobody else had, and the country needed to be run somehow. Of course, they didn't occupy very high positions anywhere, but they were these middle administrations. Those were the ones who very often, actually, this is funny, many gentry, when they were expropriated, left to the Western territory, the sort of regained territories, as is known in the parlor in socialist Poland, where there were large collective farms established. And in this early period after the war, it was the gentry who was running these estates. In many cases, not in all cases, obviously. So to get back to this generalization, as a researcher, you need to come up with some conclusions. I mean, that's why I talk about this collective biography, right? That's all that I try to accomplish in order to understand the mechanism for which people can stay as groups of importance, that keep the cohesiveness of a group, that can recognize each other as members of the same group. So we must generalize. But as I said, every life, as individual life, is lived differently, yet there are some issues that connect them.
Thank you very much. The last question, please.
Okay, and there's one more from the online participant. It's from Jan Vasevich. Thank you for a really inspiring lecture. I have a following question. Have you met the descendants of the nobility who are maybe not ashamed of being descendants of this social group, but at least were aware of its difficult heritage connected with serfdom, poddaństwo, and enforced labor, pańszczyzna?
Yeah. Yeah, the newer generation is hardly harking back to the ways the things were in the past. Yes, absolutely. It's a new generation, a new reality, and that's what makes it interesting for any scholar of society, that yet there is this recurring. They may reject the ideology, but they understand that they are part of a particular group, not that it's an organized group. But they hang out together, they marry each other, they attend each other's weddings, and so forth and so forth. They know each other's history. So it's informal. Sometimes it's formalized. There are many family associations which count hundreds of people. The bigger the noble name, the larger the association, so to say. So, yes, I don't think they are ashamed. They just historicized their past. It's just, that's what it was. We are not that anymore. But it does not mean that they reject that very identity.
Thank you very much for the lecture. Thank you for our vivid discussion. My comment pro domo sua, we should translate your book in Polish. Thank you very much. And now we have a break of 30 minutes, if I'm right. Yes. Thank you very much.